Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today is a sort of special. We are talking about only a specific kind of archetypes, blue Faeries decks, and how to approach them. Basically, how you win against them, or at least what decks are well positioned against Faeries, and why we play blue Faeries decks, and how they approach the format. So basically, Faeries has always been one of the best decks in the format, and I also think that's probably the deck with the biggest amount of banned cards in the ban list. So we have something like 6 cards banned in Faeries, not counting cards like Ponder's Ornament and GTEX and Probe, because basically they weren't really played in Faeries, or at least Ornament as one of in their sideboard, mostly in Dimir Faeries, used to play against other Ornaments decks. And GTEX and Pros was like a very weird choice in mono blue Faeries, but only sometimes. So we have Cloud of Faeries, Daze, Fall from Favor, Gash, Mystic Sanctuary, and Treasure Cruise. So yeah, 6 cards, and that's a lot of cards banned from a single archetype. Faeries nowadays is playing in three different variants. Mono Blue Faeries is the oldest of those. Then we saw the burn of Izzet Faeries, but I think that Izzet Faeries by itself is kind of really old in the format, because was already played before the Scred version of Izzet Faeries started to see play, and then the recent years Dimir Faeries became a thing. Dimir Faeries was something like a meme deck for a lot of time, but after the ban of after the ban of Mystic Sanctuary, because Mystic Sanctuary was still played in Dimir Delver and allowed Dimir Delver to still be playable, Dimir Faeries was born. Basically, Dimir Faeries was the Monarch version of Izzet Faeries, because after their ban of Fall from Favor, Dimir Faeries was the Faeries Monarch deck thanks to Turn of the Black Rose. Let's take a look at Mono Blue Faeries. Mono Blue Faeries nowadays is played as a full aggressive blue tempo deck. When I started playing Pauper, was more control-ish, with more copies of counterspell, something like 6 2-mana counterspell effects. Also notable that they weren't playing the full set of Ninja of Deity powers, but only 3 copies, and Spare Golem was the card breaking the mirror match. When I started playing Pauper, for example, Cloud of Faeries was still legal, and Mono Blue Faeries was still playing Delver of Secrets. Nowadays, Mono Blue Faeries is often dropping Delver of Secrets in favor of the second full set of 1-mana Faeries. And the reason is simple: you aren't playing so many non-creature spells, and you also want to ninjutsu your Faeries. I think that's important to notice that apparently the only deck currently playing 8 ninjas, and both Moonseeker Hacker and Ninja Infinity Powers, is Mono Blue Faeries, only because it's easier to adapt Mono Blue Faeries to the new cards. So basically, Mono Blue Faeries is running 8 copies of ninjas, only or mostly because it's easier to play the new cards in Mono Blue Faeries. Mono Blue Faeries can be also more aggressive compared to the other Faeries variants, and is also weaker in the late game against creature-based decks, That's because they are not really great to interact with permanent. They're better suited to interact with non-creature spells, usually. So right now they're also running the full, a lot of lists. They're running cards like Mutagenic Root or Mantle of Tides because they want to have better answers to interact with their opponent's creatures. Mantle of Tides is important because the 2 points in Constitution allows your ninjas or Faeries to survive against other flying creatures. For example, when you are playing against a Boros deck with a lot of flying creatures. And you can also counter your opponent burn spells, lightning bolts or galvanic blast with a Mutagenic Root. This deck is still playable, probably not a tier 1, but if you like a more aggressive approach of Faeries, I can recommend it to you. Notable that this kind of version of Blue Faeries is running only 3 copies of Ponder. Often you can see only 4 cantrips, usually Preordain. This list is kind of peculiar because they're running instead of the 4th cantrip a 4th copy of Mutagenic Root, which usually is just a free slots. And apparently a lot of Mono Blue Faeries decks are playing Off of Mind instead of the 8 copies of cantrips. Usually Mono Blue Faeries use it to play for Ponder and for Preordain, and Preordain was usually the better cantrip compared to the other one because you aren't running any fetch land. You only have a basic island. This deck usually is worth to run if you are expecting a lot of spells visit deck or control-ish style deck in form of, for example, Azorius Familiar or Jeskai Ephemerate. It's also better compared to the other Faeries variants against decks like Storm or Cycled Storm, because you have better mana and you can run more 1 mana counter spells in form of Spell Pierce and Dispel. I think that can also consider it to be better against Affinity, because nowadays Affinity is more like a mid-range, or at least it plays the control role in the matchup. So if you are playing Faeries, usually you try to be the aggro in the matchup against Affinity. Affinity used to be a good aggro deck against Faeries, but since they dropped both Carapace Forger and Gearseeker Serpent, and they're not running anymore either because it was banned. Nowadays Affinity is more like a makeshift munitions deck against Faeries. I try to interact in early game with their Galvanic Blasts and munitions, and try to grind them out with Deadly Dispute, Blood Fountain, and Reckoner's Bargain. It's kind of cool to play the matchup first against Affinity, because you don't really fear the Monarch, since you have a lot of cheap card advantage, and you can also destroy their ninjas and Faeries with munitions. That's kind of cool, from my opinion at least. Another macro archetypes, another couple of decks that are well positioned against Faeries are the Boros decks. Boros Bully is the Boros tokens deck with Battle Screech, Squadron Oak, and Seeker of the Way. Is well positioned against Faeries because they have a lot of 2-for-1, and they can interact well with 1-for-1 removal spells. They also have a lot of Swarm in form of tokens, Travel Inspector and Squadron Oak, so they can prevent the Faeries from attacking and ninjutsu them, and they can also raise Faeries with Seeker of the Way, so they can also prevent the aggro start from a Faeries eventually. I don't really like Boros Bully as I don't really like to play Boros Bully, but I think that's a solid deck against a Faeries deck. And the other Boros deck that I think that is well positioned against Faeries is the Boros Metacraft deck, which I prefer over the other one because it's just more oriented on removals and card advantage. Sometimes I'm more like a control player, a control deck player. I'm more familiar with a Glintook Gorski Fisher deck. I also think that it's better compared to Boros Bully if you want to grind out Faeries, because Experimental Synthesizer was printed in Kamigawa Neo Dynasty, and Experimental Synthesizer transform your Glintooks and Korsky Fisher in Muldrifters. So you have more card advantage, and you can still play cards like Makeshift Munitions and something like 8-born spells main deck to interact with their creatures. I think that's also important to notice how the bicolor variant of Faeries started to play the second color to interact better with mid-range decks and creature-based decks. As I said before, is that Faeries started to seen play in Pauper way before the print of Ogre of Bolas and way before they started to play Scred, but it was more like a control-ish deck with Seagate Oracle and Muldrifter. Sometimes before the print of Ogre of Bolas, at least with Scred starting to see play on Magical Line, but it was running only 1 or 2 copies of Seagate Oracle. Then they printed Ogre of Bolas, and they started to play 4 copies of Ogre of Bolas, because Ogre of Bolas is just better compared to Seagate Oracle in a deck which mostly care about ninjutsuing your value creature. So Dimir Faeries and Ether Faeries are more kind of a more grindy version of Blue Faeries decks. Dimir Faeries is more like a deck meant to interact better with Affinity and Boros decks. You can run better removal spells. Your removal spells, they can't counter it with Prismatic Strands, and you can also destroy the opponent's Traveling Inspectors, Battle Screech, and Squadron Oaks with cards like Echoing Decay and Suffocating Fumes. I think that I like more Dimir Faeries compared to the Izzet Faeries one, because you are more flexible. You also have access to Gurmag Angler, which can be a kind of good campaign against a lot of decks, and can easily block a lot of beatdown decks. Also, you run better removal spells compared to Izzet Faeries, because you have Snuff Out, and Snuff Out is something like a 0 mana removal spells in this format. You have Ice Tunnel, so you aren't really tied by fetching a basic swamp. You are losing Pyroblast, but the most played fairy decks usually the most played blue decks usually are Faeries decks. So you just need to choose between Snuff Out and Pyroblast when you want to kill your opponent ninja of deep powers. Pyroblast is great to counter stuff like Ogre of Bolas, but Snuff Out is great to prevent your opponent to ninjutsu their value creatures. Sometimes you just want to choose between Dimir Faeries and Izzet Faeries depending of the metagame. Nowadays, Dimir Faeries, for example, seems to be better against Affinity because you can overrun them with your Gurmag Anglers and turn off the back rows, because Monarch is important in the matchup against Affinity, since Affinity moved to be a mid-range style deck instead of a combo-ish style aggro deck. Anyway, you can also try to play mono blue Faeries if you just want to win against Affinity with a Faeries deck. I also want to talk about another kind of mid-range style deck, which is Pestilence. Right now we know two versions of Pestilence. The control-ish one with only Guardian of the Guild Pact as early creature, and the more control-ish one with Korsky Fisher. From my opinion, the mid-range version is well positioned against Faeries, because you run both the card advantage provided by Korsky Fisher and other creatures, and you also have the 8 cards like Guardian of the Guild Pact and Pestilence. The control version generates a less amount of card advantage and is more centered on resolving Pestilence plus Guardian of the Guild Pact to win the matchup. The mid-range one can just grind out any Faeries deck, or at least it used to be able to do that. Right now, probably can be more difficult because they both have Monarch, or they run 8 copies of the ninjas. I haven't played yet the matchup Hordes of Midrange versus Faeries, but I just guess that if they don't have a really fast start, and if you have enough lucky or enough resources in early game to stop them from overrun, you can just deploy your value threats and then slam a Pestilence in mid-late game and kill all the other stuff that survived, at least against the mono blue one. Against the Dimir Faeries deck and the Izzet Faeries deck, I think you need to keep in mind that the Monarch is a thing, so cards like Castigate or Divest can be more important against the Faeries when you are playing Pestilence. I just wanted to let you know that I think that if you want to play on North of Pestilence deck and you want to address Faeries, it's better to play the mid-range version instead of the control-ish one. From my not from my opinion, but from my experience, whenever I was playing Faeries and whenever I was facing Hordes of Control, I was always able to win against Hordes of, even when I didn't really had any important card in my sideboard. I mean, even if I didn't add Generous Edict, I was still able to win against Hordes of Pestilence, because I think that is not really reliable in mid game against Faeries, especially since they banned Ponder's Ornament, which was the best card against Faeries, at least for the control version. We already talked about the Boros decks. I think that's important to note also that Faeries, the Dimir Faeries one, at least plays better rammable spells, because I think is better positioned when it comes to mid-range stuff decks or value creatures decks, like for example Cascade Walls or Giant Midrange, or any kind of Cascade deck. So you can also address better decks like Mono White Heroic and Boggles. Boggles and Mono White Heroic and also Stompy are aggro decks that often are played to win against Faeries, and Dimir Faeries is compared to the Izzet Faeries deck is better positioned against the Aura decks. Stompy is also a good deck when it comes to play against Faeries. Basically, it doesn't have a negative matchup against any Faeries deck, but Mono Blue Faeries and Dimir Faeries are better positioned against Stompy compared to Izzet Faeries, in my opinion. That's true that Izzet Faeries runs Fairy Cannonade, but still Stompy can deploy on the battlefield a lot of good creatures, and they can protect them with Vine of Fast Foods, Anger of the Woolpack, or Elephant Guide. I think we talked about every deck. Right. As I said in the Italian version of this video, Mono Blue Faeries is better when it comes to spell decks like the combo decks, Storm, Cycle Storm, Mogwarts, and it's also important to note that the Jand piles, the Cascade piles, used to be well positioned against Faeries before the print of Modern Horizon 2. Mostly because Cleansing Wildfire wasn't played in the deck, and that deck basically played more similar to a mono black devotion deck with better card advantage. So they had a better mana because they weren't relying on solving a Cleansing Wildfire in the early game. Right now, Faeries can easily counter Cleansing Wildfire or any other mana ramp they have in the early game, especially since they don't have any more Bonder's Ornament, and Bonder's Ornament was great in mid-late game to grind out Faeries, and it's difficult there for any Cascade piles right now to interact with Faeries, especially since they have the Monarch. Basically, Faeries destroy every deck that plays only one spell per turn, especially when they have the Monarch on the battlefield. And if you compare it to the Blue Faeries version, you really need to have a lot of interaction in early game, and then you still need to play something in mid game to steal the board for something like Penumbra Spider or Noid Aldisaur. And when you are relying on having a less amount of lands in your decks because you are playing a Cleansing Wildfire and your opponent is running 4 copies of Hydroblast, is obviously difficult here to hit all your land drops. I think that the late game against decks like Jeskai Ephemerate, Familiars, and any Cascade deck is favored for those late game decks. Obviously, the early game is favored Faeries because they can play Monarch, they can play a Ninja, and they have better answers for the early game in form of counter spells or removal spells like Scred or Snuff Out. Well, we talked about everything, I think. We can talk about also Mono Blackburn and Rakdos Madness if you want, because Faeries is well positioned against Burn, but the black variants of Burn are better positioned in the matchup compared to the mono red one. That's because you can't really Hydroblast black burn spells, and this spell is less effective as well as Spell Status Sprite, since their burn spells cost more than 1 mana, and they can also run more card advantage. Burn is not really playing any card advantage nowadays, but Blackburn and Rakdos Madness, they can generate a lot of card advantage in form of Madness spells and Singing Blood. So if you want to play a burn spells, I suggest you to play Blackburn or Rakdos Madness if you are facing a lot of Faeries deck. I haven't played any Blackburn or Rakdos Madness until now, but when I was playing Faeries, I was fearing more Blackburn compared to Mono Redburn. For today we talk about Faeries enough, so I see you in the next week with some upload from my Twitch channel. On Twitch I will also play some Storm, since I found it as really powerful and reliable compared to the version that some players like Sayaraken was trying to play in Pauper. For the next week of Pauper news, I think we will eventually talk about Affinity or the Boros decks. If you guys that watched this video until now found this special helpful or interesting to see. So guys, see you in the next week. Bye.